Is everyone in? Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mac D'Alessandro. I'm a partner in Democracy Partners, and we are so excited to be hosting this evening's session about American labor. Why work isn't working so well for so many today. I wanted to spend just a couple minutes laying out what this evening is going to look like, and then introduce our esteemed panelists for what I'm sure will be a very enriching and enlightening conversation. So again, I'm Mac D'Alessandro. A little bit about me. I come out of the labor movement, worked for many years for the Service Employees International Union. And my last job there was the Eastern Region Political Director for SCIU. And with us tonight, we have Saru Jayaraman from One Fair Wage, Adam Obernauer from the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Workers Union, and also Damon Silvers from the AFL-CIO. I'd like to ask each of them to introduce themselves very briefly, and then I'll lay out how we're going to structure our conversation this evening. Saru, why don't you kick us off?
All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm here, I'm in the middle of teaching class today at UC Berkeley. We've got about 160 students with me. So it's me and a lot of people, but my name is Saru. I teach here at Berkeley, but I also lead I've co-founded and led various organizations over the last 20 years to fight for higher wages and better working conditions in the service sector generally, and the restaurant industry in particular, and have been particularly fighting over the last decade to not just raise the overall minimum wage, but end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and other workers in the US.
Great, thanks, Saru. Adam.
Hey everyone, my name is Adam Obernauer, and I am the director of our retail organizing project at RWDSU, the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. And I have participated in many organizing campaigns in the retail sector, from the Zara campaign to Guitar Center, most recently to Housing Works in New York City, and also have been running the Amazon organizing campaign along with our council in Bessemer, Alabama.
Awesome, thanks, Adam. And last but certainly not least, and I don't know if he was en route to a settled location, but Damon Silvers from the AFL-CIO. Damon, you want to introduce yourself? Is Damon on mute?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. I double muted myself. Listen, I'm sorry I'm not quite visible yet. That will change in a minute. I'm Damon Silvers. I am assistant to the president and special counsel at the AFL-CIO. I'm very honored to say that at the moment, I'm assistant to the first woman president of the AFL-CIO. And that's an amazing recent development. And I apologize for not being visible. I'm on my way back from the opening of the Elijah Cummings room at Busboys and Poets here in Baltimore with the Cummings family. And it was an event that I just could not miss. So at the moment, though relevant to this discussion, I'm directing the campaign to pass the PRO Act, comprehensive and profoundly structural labor law reform for the AFL-CIO. In the past, I was policy director for the Federation for many years. And before that, directed the Capital Stewardship Program. I was deputy chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel with Elizabeth Warren for the bank bailout. Sort of just a little background on who I am. So with that, I'll wrap it up and appear visually in just a moment.
Great, thanks, Damon. So here's how we're going to have this structure this conversation tonight. The goal is to have everyone hear as much from these experts as possible, but also to have an interaction with all of you that are joining us this evening. in an extended question and answer period. So we're going to start with each of our panelists. We know a lot about some of the sobering statistics around the American labor movement, the mid-single digit private sector union membership, and all of the attacks that even predate Scott Walker's ascension in Wisconsin on public sector collective bargaining. But beyond what's happening in labor, there's a lot about why work doesn't seem to work for so many anymore in this country and around the world. I'd like our first 10 minutes for our panelists to offer their perspectives on why that is. So we can really start to define this problem, not just as a matter of the American labor movement, but as the larger issue about why it's so hard for so many to get by today. After that, I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists, and I'll give our panelists opportunities to interact and ask questions of one another. We'll do that for about 20 minutes. And then we're going to spend 45 minutes opening up the floor to all of you to ask your questions of our panelists and let really have an enriching conversation about how we might solve some of these really seemingly intractable problems. I'd like us to have an honest and civil conversation. I know that on subjects like this, often passions can run high. My job will be to make sure that we go right up to the point of having a really engaging conversation, but one that stays within the bounds of respect and civility for one another. And then we'll in the last few minutes, we'll wrap this up with a couple of brief messages from our panelists about things that all of us can do to advance the cause of workers in this country and around the world. So to start things off, I said a minute ago, we all know the dire straits that the American labor movement is in, but I think more broadly and more importantly, the dire straits that so many American workers face, including those, some of whom are in the labor movement. So I wanted to pose this question, this kickoff question to our panelists. Why is that? Why is this problem so big, so deep, and so difficult to overcome? Adam, I want to start with you. Just spend a couple of minutes providing your insights to that question.
Thanks so much, Mac. And thank you for having me here today. I guess there's many things I could say here, but I'll try to center it around the recent Amazon organizing that we've been doing at the RWDSU in Bessemer, Alabama, but at large. I would say that overall, we've seen a shift towards precarious work, right? And work that is more tend to be hourly, part-time workers, a workforce that is seen as temporary. At Amazon, they've taken advantage of what they have as a model to have workers work themselves, in some cases, literally to death, and work as fast as possible to have their labor output be as maximized as possible without the care for any human being in the process, right? And what I mean by that is the high turnover model specifically to avoid unionization. It's specifically to have workers master one task until they can do it fast enough until their bodies break down. Workers at Amazon are constantly passing out in the warehouses throughout the country. There have been instances even in the Bessemer facility where a worker asked to leave and then was told that he couldn't because he could get reprimanded, and then passed out and had a heart attack at work and died. They're really sad stories that you can see, and those are in the microcosm. But in the macro picture, Amazon is kind of the epicenter in many ways of what the future of work will become. Amazon continues to grow as an employer. They have more during the pandemic. They have grown exponentially, both in their profits and in the opening of new facilities and fulfillment centers, sort centers. You see overall, globalization has led towards, and bad trade deals have led towards a lot of old industrial infrastructure leaving the United States. For example, in Bessemer, just to keep it there, the Amazon facility is in what was U.S. Steel, right? So good unionized jobs that are being outsourced and then replaced by what Amazon or would say are good $15 an hour jobs, but $15 an hour is not what they were paying in US Steel and unionized jobs. It's not what they were paying in the same exact locations for what is now of the past, right? Of a workforce of the past that doesn't exist anymore in the United States to the same degree it did. And so what we see is a shift towards a workforce that is not less skilled, but that the employer makes the case that it should be transactional work, very quick, easy to plug in, workers left and right, churning them out until they literally can't do the work anymore. They go on medical leave and they're just trying to make it. And then there's an endless amount of supply because the places that Amazon sets up these fulfillment centers, they purposely are setting them up in communities where $15 an hour would seem like a great gig until you literally just break down. So I would say centering it on Amazon, I could say a lot more, but I know the other panelists will focus on other aspects of it to bring the conversation together.
Thank you, Adam. You mentioned something that I think is a great segue to Saru, which is precarious work. And, I know a lot of people have talked a lot about the restaurant industry and the impact that COVID has had, but I know, Saru, you've seen the precariousness of work in that sector dating back a hell of a lot longer than we've been dealing with COVID. Share with us a little bit of your perspective from that sector.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Is this okay that I'm talking on the mic, and can you hear me okay on the?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no echo.
Okay. Just before we got on in our class, we were talking about the New Deal, and I do think there's a sense among some when we have this conversation that labor had its heyday at the New Deal, and we've kind of lost ground in terms of like worker protections and worker organizing and worker power since then. But there's only one problem with that kind of story, which is that there have been groups of workers that never had their heyday, that were left out of the New Deal, that were always in a precarious situation dating back to slavery in the United States. And I mean Black workers in particular, workers of color and women of color in particular, who didn't have their heyday with the New Deal. So in the restaurant industry, it's important to go way back, as you said. Tipping originated in feudal Europe. It was something that was given as an extra or bonus. That's the origination of tipping, an extra or bonus by aristocrats to serfs and vassals on top of a wage. And that only changed in the US because of slavery. At emancipation, the restaurant industry wanted the ability to hire Black people and not pay them anything at all and have them live entirely on tips. And so they mutated the notion of tipping at emancipation from being an extra or bonus on top of a wage to becoming a replacement for wages, to becoming the wage itself. And in many instances, they even actually charged Black people for the privilege of obtaining white people's tips in a position as a server or a porter or a shoe shiner. And so there were two large industries that benefited from this moment. One was the Pullman car porters, who, as many of you know, formed the first Black union in the United States, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Maryland and others celebrated them this past Labor Day weekend with the creation of the National Monument in Chicago, which is great. But we lifted up as part of that recognition that those workers, the Pullman car porters, who were Black men who traveled on the luxury trains serving white customers, they organized and won the right to an actual wage rather than living on customer tips. But there was a group of Black workers, namely Black women at the time, who were not so lucky. There was no union for them, and those were tipped restaurant workers, and they were left out of the New Deal. When the New Deal gave the right to the minimum wage for everybody else, the federal minimum wage for the first time, millions of Black workers were left out. Farm workers were left out, who were mostly Black at the time. Domestic workers were left out, who were mostly Black women. And tipped restaurant workers were told, you get a $0 minimum wage. If tips bring you to the full minimum wage, great, but we are not going to require your employer to pay you a wage. and that we went from a $0 wage for tipped workers who are mostly Black, mostly women at the time of the New Deal, 1938, all the way to $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States, who are still to this day overwhelmingly women, disproportionately women of color. So these workers didn't have their heyday in 1938, and we've seen a decline. No, they've never had a heyday. If anything, they're having a heyday right now, right now, when we are seeing millions of these workers. And by the way, the other thing that happened over those 80 years since 1938 is that the restaurant industry, unfortunately, being the lowest paid and the least organized, exploded and became the second largest private sector employer in the United States, the #1 fastest growing private sector employer in the United States. We almost hit 14 million workers before the pandemic. That's 1 in 10 American workers. But we have been the lowest paid workforce for 150 years because of this ugly legacy of slavery. And the pandemic only made those conditions worse. The precarity of living off of tips, the sexual harassment that this largely female workforce faced, having to get tips from customers, just got worse. 6 million workers lost their jobs. 2/3 said they couldn't get unemployment insurance because they were told their wages were too low to qualify. And then they went back to work, tips way down, sexual harassment way up. Thousands of women reporting that they're repeatedly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you. To the point where millions left. Millions left. The industry said, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. And that has resulted in disruption and wages going up in a way we haven't seen in the last 150 years. So we didn't have a heyday and it's gotten worse. It's been terrible for a long time. And if anything, this is a moment for us to change it.
Thanks, Saru. And so obviously the restaurant sector, the retail sector have really kind of risen to the fore in large part because they've become such large parts of the American economy. Damon, I wonder if you could share your perspective from the federation of so many different sectors that comprise the AFL-CIO. What are folks saying at the Fed about the state of work in this country? We know that union membership has been on the decline, but I know the AFL also does a lot to support workers, whether or not they belong to a union. What's your perspective?
Thank you, Mac. And I mean, obviously, this is a large question. I'm not sure that the 2 minutes or so that I have is going to do it justice. But let me just first frame for folks a little bit what the AFL-CIO is, so that you understand how we fit into this picture. The AFL-CIO is America's labor federation. We are not a union. We are a federation of unions. There are 55 national unions that belong to the AFL-CIO, and additional unions that participate in the AFL-CIO's regional structures. We represent about 12 million workers and their families. And from that vantage point, I mean, it's a sad fact, right, that when the AFL-CIO was formed in 1955, about 35% of the American private sector workforce, right, was in a union and was engaged in collective bargaining. Interestingly, at that time, close to 0% of the public sector workforce was in the union and engaged in collective bargaining. Today, it's 6.7% in the private sector and about 33% in the public sector. After Scott Walker, after Janus, after all these attacks on the public sector unions, still public sector union membership is about where private sector union membership used to be. Now, union membership, as I think you've kind of heard from the other panelists, and by the way, the retail workers are an affiliate of the AFL-CIOs. As Adam knows, and we have worked. And to your point about larger stuff, we've worked with a variety of worker centers, groups, and so forth, and with Saru and the various in various things, structures that Saru has been involved in, and particularly in the fight around tipped workers, which was a passion, let me say, of our President Trumka, Rich Trumka, who just died, the AFL-CIO. It was truly something he was personally dedicated to, was the fight for a single minimum wage for everyone. the answer in short, I think, is that American workers' bargaining power has been systematically attacked through both corporate strategy and public policy for a generation. Now, the starting point, as Saru just laid out, was not perfect in a big bad way, but it was moving in the 1970s in a positive direction. Particularly for African American workers, right? When a systematic attack was launched against American workers' bargaining power and political power by American business and by right-wing political forces who, imperfect as the New Deal was, had never reconciled themselves to the idea that the government should regulate the economy or do anything for workers. That attack, which was initially brought by Ronald Reagan and the forces around him, but had many layers. So a part of it was the weakening of labor law. Part of it was running the US economy at less than full employment, which was something the Federal Reserve did. Part of it was trade policy designed to put downward pressure on wages and erode the manufacturing sector. Part of it was the destruction of employment law enforcement, of minimum wage enforcement, of child labor enforcement. Part of it was creating an underclass of undocumented workers with no rights, right? That acted as a systematic downward pressure on the fact they had no rights. By the way, it's not immigration, it's the creation of a caste of people with no rights. That is the issue there. All of these things work together to erode worker bargaining power. It's important to understand. People say, well, can we afford what GM paid in the 1950s, right? We are a fantastically more wealthy country than we were during the heyday of industrial unionism. We can easily afford to provide a good living to everyone who works in this country, whether they work in a high-tech company or in a restaurant. We can afford to do that easily. What has happened is that the erosion of worker bargaining power, the shift in public policy has led to all the money flowing to the top. The numbers on this are outrageous and they're self-reinforcing, meaning that the political economy of the United States has been fundamentally warped by inequality in a way that simply adds to the bargaining power of employers and of capital and detracts from that of working people. But the good side, and I think Saru talked about this for a moment, I've just painted a rather bleak picture. I hope we can focus from here on what Saru was saying before, that for many respects for working people, particularly for young working people, now is the best time ever, right? Now is the best time ever in terms of the people's sense of their own power and the possibilities of what can be done. And I can say as a relatively old person that from a policy perspective and from an economic perspective and a kind of technical sense, now is the best time, despite everything, despite COVID, despite Trump, despite everything. Now is the best time, but it is a moment of opportunity which we have to seize. It's not like, oh well, we just got it. Of course we don't. But what we have is a spirit abroad among working people that, if fed and seized, can make really profound and positive change. And so I hope we can kind of turn to that, having sort of dug in a little bit as to what went wrong.
Damon, you have just modeled being both an excellent panelist and moderator, because you have provided an excellent segue into, I think, what I hope is the most invigorating part of this conversation, because I hope everyone agrees that yes, there's a lot of really grim stuff going on. There's workers are facing an incredible amount of challenge out there, some COVID related, some not, but there are so many opportunities. So let's turn there. And Damon, I think there's some buckets you offered that I think are good kind of starting off point. I think there's kind of a legal policy political bucket that in which there are opportunities. Right now, a lot of barriers. There's also the bargaining power bucket and how that's achieved. For the uninitiated on the call, I don't know if folks are aware that you don't have to be in a union to be covered by the National Labor Relations Act. And you can actually, there is power there if you work with others to assert it. So there's the bargaining power bucket, and then there's just the kind of, I don't know, I guess I'd call it the spiritual bucket, the moment at which, you know, we're having our movie network moment where, you know, I'm fed up and I can't take it anymore. And that so many workers, I think, are feeling in their day-to-day lives. So why don't we start there, and we'll start, Saru, with you. What are some of the opportunities that you're seeing in the restaurant sector or the labor generally to advance the cause of working people?
Yeah, there's I'm calling it a moment of upheaval and disruption in our industry, because some of what I kind of ran through really quickly is what led to this moment that some people are calling a labor shortage. We're calling it a wage shortage, because there are plenty of people ready to work, want to work, worked in the industry their whole lives. They're just not willing to do it for these wages anymore. There was a really good article. I'm going to steal somebody. I'm sorry, I don't remember the author, but said it's sort of like saying there's a shortage of Mercedes-Benzes for $1,000. There's no shortage of Mercedes-Benzes. There's a shortage of Mercedes-Benzes for $1,000. There's a shortage if you only are willing to pay $2, which is why we call it a wage shortage. So, as I said, these workers were in crisis pre-pandemic. The media is talking as if the staffing crisis is now. Oh no, these workers left this industry last year. So last year, March, when the shutdown happened, we started a workers applied, and these relief funds, we weren't the only one. I'm sure, AFL started relief. There were lots of relief funds, and that in and of itself was a moment that was an incredible opportunity. I had been organizing restaurant workers for 20 years. After 20 years at Rock, we had maybe 30,000 workers. In 2 months at one fair wage, when we started our relief fund, we had a base of 266,000 restaurant workers across the country that we immediately started organizing and talking to and surveying and building power with. And what they told us was, after the shutdown, 2/3, 63%, could not get unemployment insurance because they were told in most states your wage of $2 or $3 is too low to qualify for benefits. And that was the first light bulb moment, where millions of workers across the country who had been earning $2 and $3 and $4 since emancipation, suddenly a light bulb went off. Wait a second, if the government is telling me I'm earning too little to get benefits, maybe I'm earning too little, period. And I should refuse to work for this wage. And people left the industry in that moment, not now. And then some of them went back to work and found that tips were way down because sales were down, and the level of hostility was crazy in restaurants. Customers were berating workers, asking them to take off their masks. Workers were asked to do all of these additional things, make the people sit 6 feet apart, make them wear masks. Now, check whether they have vaccines or not. The level of responsibility, given the level of the amount of wage, it just didn't add up anymore. And millions left the industry last year saying, you don't pay me enough to be the police of the vaccine and the COVID. You don't pay me enough to put up with this level of hostility and harassment. You don't pay me enough to risk my life and my family's life. And so they left. And last year itself, we started organizing wage strikes, because I'm telling you, organizing workers for 20 years in this industry, I had never seen in my life so many workers saying, I refuse to go back. I am literally withholding my labor. I refuse to go back unless they change the wage. And so we started organizing wage strikes all of last summer. And I do believe, because we were in conversation with the Biden-Harris campaign at the time, I do believe that helped the Biden-Harris campaign name as a priority in their campaign, not just a $15 minimum wage, but a full, complete end and phase out of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and workers with disabilities. And Damon's right, the AFL has been with us on that for several years, and SEIU and many others, and we so appreciate that. But we hadn't heard it from a president during their campaign. And we were very pleased to hear it because I think there was a recognition that workers weren't going back. So this year, when restaurants finally caught on because governors were finally allowing them to reopen, and they realized what we had been saying all of last year, workers have left in mass exodus. They're not coming back unless you raise the wage. I think they suddenly realized that was true. And we did a survey in June, we released of 3,000 workers, 53% of workers who remain right now in the restaurant industry are saying they're leaving. And 80% say the only thing that will make them stay or come back is a full livable wage with tips on top. This has resulted in literally thousands of restaurants across the country raising wages. As an example, there is a board member of the National Restaurant Association, a former board member, restaurant owner in New Hampshire, who Senators Hassan and Shaheen cite as the reason why they haven't voted in favor of the Raise the Wage Act. And that restaurant owner has been the biggest opposition in New Hampshire against raising the minimum wage and ending the minimum wage to tipped workers. Last week on his Facebook, he announced he is offering $13.50 plus tips to servers in his restaurants. This is the kind of massive change that we are seeing all over the country. We are hearing restaurants paying $30 an hour because they can't get workers to come back to work. And as Damon and Adam have said, this is the moment when workers have realized their power. They've said, we're not going back. They don't know whether they have rights under the NLA or not, nor do they care. They're just doing it. They are organizing. They're organizing unions in restaurants. They're demanding higher wages. And employers are responding with those higher wages. And this is why policymakers need to step into the You're on mute, Nah.
I'm trying to keep my rather loud dog from joining the conversation. Adam, it occurs to me that you guys ran a fantastic drive down there. And just as the retail sector has undergone such a radical transformation in the last 10, 20 years, so too, I would imagine, have the way in which we attempt to organize workers. What kind of opportunities have you discovered to change the way, if you think a change is necessary, in the way we organize workers in this new economy?
Yeah, thanks, Mac. That's a great question, and thanks, Saru, for your comments. It has me thinking a lot of, starting from what we heard when in Bessemer, Alabama, when Amazon workers came to the Union Hall, was that between 30 to 50 workers at the fulfillment center walking out every day, just quitting, leaving the job. And how do we capitalize on a moment where Amazon took away COVID pay for $2 and change, right? Because the pandemic was quote unquote over. No one thinks the pandemic's over, and Amazon is making tons of money over the pandemic, right? Which we all know. And so I would say that, looking at that and comparing it to restaurant work too, and other work, is there's a lot of ex-restaurant workers that work at Amazon, right? Because they left the restaurant industry. They're now working at Amazon, and it's all connected, right? All of this, in when you look at just employers that are paying low wages in general, we have to look at organizing as a movement, right? It can't just be a sectoral look towards, well, we have this jurisdiction, we have that jurisdiction. We need to have a labor movement that's more encompassing, that looks at the whole worker. Because then when you look at a worker that may have been involved in some type of action at the restaurant that they were in, they leave the restaurant and then they get a job at a place that, like Amazon, where they may want to organize as well. And I'd say that you see a lot of resistance today. I mean, we get tons of calls from workers all over, in retail, in the Amazon fulfillment centers all over the country, that are saying that they want to organize, right? And how do we capitalize on that moment? You look at how the Bessemer workers started organizing, and it's kind of like they lit a match, they threw it into a pile of sticks, right? And that fire, I think, inspired tons of workers from around the country, because what workers were saying to us so much is, but it's Amazon. We can't take on Amazon. We're just in Bessemer, Alabama. Like, we don't have the power to take on Amazon. And then when you look at how much resources Amazon put in to crush the union effort, which we all expected, right? They have limitless resources. but to see that a group of workers can actually fight back against Amazon and against capital, because that's what we're looking at here. And that's how Amazon sees it, in the way that they did, to fight back against the constant production line continuing to push workers to drive themselves to work to death just to get their productivity up, with no plan of staying at Amazon for a long period of time. You know, we see that we have to capitalize on that opportunity as a labor movement, because if we don't, workers won't have a structure in which they can organize and fight back in a way that would be as positive as it could be. I'll leave it there, right? But on side of that, you see Amazon workers and workers in industries too taking it upon themselves to walk out and do their own actions. There's so much happening, even with the Amazon workers in Minnesota, in Chicago, forming their own organization. You see that happening a lot more. Younger workers are taking ownership of their campaigns in a way that is incredible today. And I'd say that that's another way in which we need to approach organizing differently, is that workers need to own their campaigns in a way that, not that they always should have, but in a way today, I see a lot more of that. And I'd say when we're looking at organizing, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but we need to organize in the community. You know, when we're in Bessemer, everyone from the local restaurant, the local business, to the local community supports Amazon union. They support the union at Amazon. They shout out, you can't walk around with a red RWDSU shirt in Alabama, Birmingham, and in Bessemer and not be stopped by somebody saying, oh, are you with the Amazon union? Oh, I'm rooting for you guys. That's going to change our account. That's going to change the local economy. It's the reality. So people support unions. The polls all show that people support unions. How do we transition that to people support unions in their workplace? It's different. It's a different thing to say the majority of young people support unions. Yeah, theoretically. But how do we make that transition to the majority of young people support unions and are willing to unionize where they work? And that's something that we do by gaining trust, by building as a labor movement, you know, the partnerships between organizations like One Fair Wage and traditional unions. And in general, how do we take on organizing as a whole? And it's all encompassing, you know, and like we've said, you know, we support organizing in Amazon in every respect, because resistance against Amazon is important and they all fit as pieces in the puzzle, whether it's an NLRB election in Bessemer, Alabama, or it's workers taking their own action in another state. It all fits into the puzzle of a bigger picture. And I'll leave it there.
You know, Damon, Adam mentioned something I thought was very interesting, and he mentioned that kind of the kind of sector-based approach. And I think I think you might agree that over time, American labor has kind of, in some ways, gotten in its own way by having kind of a too rigid a sector-focused, and you know, you see sometimes jurisdictional battles arrive, and we end up fighting each other instead of fighting the boss. How do you, from the AFL's perspective, how do you see this, like, capture some of what Adam's talking about, this kind of the organic kind of uprisings and demonstrations that American workers are undertaking on their own? And how do you think the labor movement needs to adapt to this new way in which kind of organizing in a lot of places is happening on its own?
Well, Mac, let me just first say, this isn't the new way. This is the old way, right? If you want to, the labor movement has never, the labor movement, in whatever way you want to understand it, and the labor movement is a constantly changing thing, right? It's not a particular organizational form. In fact, within the AFL-CIO, we have unions that are really radically different in the way that they operate, in their histories. The labor movement is not a particular way of organizing, but whatever form you look at through time, workers only get power when workers self-organize. That the sustaining power is a different matter. But getting it only happens when workers self-organize. And so the reason why I was so enthusiastic about Saru's point that now you know now is the best of times, not some other time, but now, is because of all of the kind of bubblings of self-organization going on among American workers. That's the great, to my mind, that is the great source of hope and possibility in this moment. And I want to say a word or two more about it, because I just want to summon an image in people's minds. By the way, before I do that, I want to correct something Adam said, and I hope he'll forgive me. It's not that young people are for unions. It's that all Americans are for unions. All right. The Gallup poll came out last week that has been taken about American voters' attitudes towards unions. Been taken since the 1930s. All right. 68% of those polled expressed support for unions. It's the highest number since the early 1960s, and it's on par with Saru mentioned 1938. It's on par with the number from 1938. Now, this is a peculiar thing, considering that only 6.5% of the private sector workforce is in a union. For every worker in a union, there are 10 people who want one. All right. The problem is, how do you go in a situation where, as my friend Elizabeth Warren would say, the rules have been rigged? How do you go from where people's kind of inchoate feelings are to something real, and to a real expression of power? And by the way, by that, I do not mean that you have to go organize something that looks like an industrial union in 1950, right? That's not, by the way, that's not what people are doing in the workplace. They're building organizations that are organic expressions of their workplace, their experience, their needs. So to come back to this question of self-organization, it's really important to understand every era of labor movement growth has been about self-organization, right? People who have a literary bent ought to read Saul Bellow's book, The Adventures of Augie March. There's a description of what it was like to organize in the retail sector in Chicago in 1937. And the way it was done was the organizer would drive around town with a stack of cards and throw them over inside the stores. And then they'd come back in the afternoon and collect them. Now, anyone who's actually done any union organizing in our time knows that's not how it's done. Maybe at Bessemer it was done a little bit that way, which is why we're so optimistic. But the point is, when a labor movement is growing, you don't need professional organizers. A movement means people are doing it themselves. Same thing was true, by the way, in the growth of the public sector labor movement in the 1960s and 1970s. The famous strike of the Memphis sanitation workers, where Dr. King was killed. Right? That strike wasn't organized by sending some people down from New York. That strike was organized because sanitation workers in Memphis did it themselves, and then they called for help. Right? So when we see self-organization happening, that's like the great thing. But how does self-organization explode? Right? Self-organization explodes when you win. When you beat Amazon, not when you take on Amazon, when you beat them, right? The explosion of the labor movement in the 1930s occurred after they beat GM, because GM was the most powerful company in the world. And if a bunch of auto workers in Flint, Michigan could beat GM, then any worker could beat any employer. That same logic informed the growth of the public sector labor movement. Illegal strikes by teachers and sanitation workers and hospital workers in the 1960s and 1970s, when they won, other people said, oh, hey, I can do that. Right? We have to beat people. We have to beat powerful employers like Amazon. Right? And that is the task that's in front of us as a labor movement. And I would just say that it's critical to understand that dynamic, the dynamic of self-organization and strategic victories, is integral to any concept of public policy change. It's when you have those dynamics in motion that public policy change becomes possible. It's when people start looking around and saying, the chaos in the American workplace, right? Maybe we ought to have some kind of more orderly process here, right? What Sarah was talking about, and I'm surprised she didn't use the word, was a strike. Right? A national strike of restaurant workers, informal, self-organized, but a strike. At some point, somebody may say, well, doesn't everything work a little better if instead we have some rational process for setting wages that people can actually work for? Right? The policy process and the process of self-organization, the process of taking on and defeating major employers, right? That's all one, right? And it's very important that it be understood by people concerned about where this country is going in a broader sense, to understand how critical that dynamic is. And the policy process is essential to locking in the gains, to going from mass action to a political economy that is actually fair and democratic. And so I put that on the table. Beck, I don't want to sound like I'm ignoring your question about siloing and all that. I would just say that the institutional labor movement created a lot of structures to try to avoid, unions fighting with each other, right? That's what the AFL-CIO's original purpose was. Before it did politics, before it did organizing, before it did anything, it was to mediate those kinds of disputes. Ironically, the way in which those structures function is to silo unions, right? Is that you say, you say, you're not going to individual unions aren't going to fight over jurisdiction because you get this jurisdiction and you get that jurisdiction, right? The problem we have, in my view, is we don't have enough industrial in the economic sense of the term, right? The restaurant is an industry, restaurants are an industry. Tech, tech is an industry, retail is an industry, gig and Uber and Lyft are an industry. We don't have enough industrial focus. But at the same time, we need cross-industry collaboration and aid, right? We need the kind of spirit that motivated the CIO, where mine workers and textile workers said, our situation is hopeless unless we organize steel workers and auto workers. Today, it's a whole different set of categories, right? The biggest unions in the AFL-CIO and the biggest unions in the American labor movement are the two teachers unions, SEIU, AFSCME, the Teamsters, and the UFCW. If you think about them and you think about where the workforce is, you'll see that we desperately need this kind of collaboration. And I will say that I believe that the prospects for that kind of collaboration, for example, around Amazon, are better today than they've been in my career, because I think there's a realization that, as Benjamin Franklin said, hang together, you will surely hang separately.
Well, I'm looking at I want to be mindful of the clock. It's amazing how when you're having an interesting conversation, time seems to move more quickly. We did promise folks an opportunity to ask questions. I did want to start and offer, is Denise Boyer on?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Denise, I was told that you were to be able to offer the first question to our panel, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm representing the American Sustainable Business Council and American Income Life, who are gaining business support for the PRO Act. And it's an interesting thing because not only morally and ethically should businesses support it, but it's really good for the bottom line too. And that's the business case we're trying to create, as well as the fact that if you're an employer, and ESG and racial equity and all of those issues are so important to so many progressive businesses today, the PRO Act and passing that is going to be the piece of legislation that creates that balance and gives that opportunity. So my question is, people on the panel, how do you see yourselves engaging and helping bring that business voice to the table on the PRO Act? We do have a business sign-on letter I'd love to share with people. And do you see the need for it, as well as reaching out to progressive businesses we do business with in other areas? Sometimes they're not as good on labor issues. And how do we bridge that gap? So that's my question. Might be two questions.
I think folks thought, that you guys hope you didn't get accustomed to the softballs from me, because, we were going to have some really good questions. We got a couple from Denise, and I think there's going to be a lot more from our other participants. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Listen, Matt, can I just say, I know I spoke just a moment ago, but first, I just want to say, Denise, I didn't know you were going to be on the call, and the folks on this call should know the extraordinary work that Denise has done on behalf of working people in organizing to support the PRO Act. Just really, really outstanding work. Look, and I'll just say it really matters that there are business voices for workers, and that Adam talked about it a moment or two ago, and Saru kind of alluded to it. But you know, it's a much healthier climate for most business people when working people actually have some money to spend and are not living in economic terror. It's really actually good for business. And it's also good for small business in particular to have working people have a big, powerful voice in our country, because we create, we are the only real source of pushback against monopoly power in the economy. And that is good for small business. And so lifting up those voices, it just is really, really, really important. And Denise has done incredible work in that way. And just we're very grateful.
Well, and I'd like to, so you know, I think we've got these kind of very different perspectives here. Saru, you're working in a sector that has a lot of small businesses, independently owned businesses, and you know, forget the big national chains for a second. And then Adam, you've been focused on one of the world's largest multinational corporations. How do you, in these respective circumstances, deal with employers or work to identify cooperative ones, or make the case that the way we treat workers, if we treat workers well, the bottom line improves? Saru, we'll start with you.
So our industry actually has both. We have humongous national chains, and then we've got literally about 1 million independent restaurants across the country that are small to medium size. So, and I think it's important to name that the standards are set in our industry by the big chains. Darden, which is Olive Garden's parent company, but owns 10 other brands. It's the largest employer of tipped workers in the world. These are multinational corporations. Disney is a leader in the national restaurant. Everybody should know the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. They're the biggest block to so many of the things that we care about in this country. And so what we've done is to try to divide that group and build an association of, we call them high road restaurant owners. It's during the pandemic, it exceeded 1,000 restaurants across the country, including some chains, no full service chains, but Cava Grill is a part of it. And some larger companies and Pizza is a chain that's part of our High Road Restaurant Association. And so our work has been to, just like Damon was just saying, organize the independent restaurant owners and a few good chains to say that actually the other NRA doesn't speak for us, and the voice of the other NRA really representing these huge multinational multi-billion dollar corporations is not our voice and undercuts us. And in fact, right now, more than ever, when these independent restaurant owners are raising their wages to $15, $20, some cases $30 an hour, and joining us in saying to Congress, we need you to raise the wage through policy, because it is not fair that we're raising our wages and Denny's and IHOP are still paying $2 an hour. That doesn't work. And unless everybody goes up, people aren't going to be able to afford the increased prices that come. They're moderately increased prices, but somewhat increased prices that come as you raise the wage from $2 to $15 an hour. So we have been organizing these independent restaurant owners and a few chains, and it is definitely gaining steam, and so much so that we're seeing some breakthroughs in the chains. So in April, there was an expose in Newsweek of the major chains that had actually told Congress in February, there is no way we can afford $15 an hour. Paying a full minimum wage to tipped workers instead of $2 will kill us. In that same moment, the CFO of Denny's and Cheesecake Factory were caught in a public shareholder meeting saying actually paying 15 and one fair wage allowed our company to grow faster in California than any other state in the country. Why? Because with the wages higher, customers were able to spend more, our company grew faster. So they were telling shareholders raising wages was a very good thing in California for the company, and at the same moment telling Congress we can't do this. So we organized a large group of shareholders to then tell the multinational corporations, wait a second, if you're saying raising wages is good for shareholders, you fighting it is actually going against your fiduciary duty to shareholders. We had a second great expose article as a result of that in Newsweek with the title Shareholder Revolt in some of the biggest restaurant companies. So we are seeing some real movement in the big companies thanks to activity among the small and independent restaurant businesses. And happy to talk more about how they can engage on the PRO Act. Right now, they are all focused with us on the Raise the Wage Act, which is another really important bill that the AFL and SEIU and others have been a part of, again, to raise the minimum wage to 15 and end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. We need both.
Thank you.
And Adam, any thoughts on that question about employers and your approach?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think that, if there are employers that would, I'll leave it at this. I tend to think every employer is anti-union, even if they have one, right? And so they theoretically would rather not have the union. But I know that that's just a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. And to say that, I say that just to always be prepared, right? Because when you have a unionized shop, you're just always preparing for what might be fighting back against, for concessions and things. But the idea, and I think that that Brock and other One Fair Wage, I mean, there's phenomenal work in getting smaller businesses to support, like the One Fair Wage legislation, and it's been fantastic. There's a lot of smaller retailers too that we've organized, especially in New York. Like a lot of the independent bookstores are organized now too, and those employers tend to be, more amenable to unionization. So it's definitely something that is a great question, and it's interesting, but it's not, as someone doing the ground organizing work for our external campaigns, it's not something I've focused on.
And we have a question for Saru from Harry. Is Harry on?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead with your question, Harry.
So, Saru, I agree with you that restaurant workers are a cutting edge. I disagree with you that the lessons of the New Deal are old-fashioned and irrelevant and to be forgotten. So here I want to just voice the lessons and wisdom I learned from Nellie Stone Johnson, organizer for the hotel and restaurant workers in the 30s and 40s, a great leader in Black trade unionism and the Coalition for Trade Union Women and other efforts. So I asked Nellie, she was a mentor of mine when I moved to Minnesota in the late 70s, through the 80s and 90s. I asked Nellie one time, what do you think weakened unions? And she said, in the hotel and restaurant workers, we used to have storefront offices with a pot-bellied stove, and people in the neighborhood on the north side, a Black neighborhood, or the Northeast, the ethnic neighborhood, could come in and talk and socialize, and they developed a sense that the union movement was ours. It wasn't transactional. It wasn't simply about wages and working conditions. It was about creating a better way of life that was different than the consumerist view. So I think that's what unions have in significant ways lost, the sense of kind of community roots. And also, Nellie used to talk all the time about the Commonwealth. She said, people, progressives today do not know what the Commonwealth used to mean to working people. It was our North Star. And I never hear people talk about that. Commonwealth was powerful because people felt they were making a world of common things that we all were involved in. So that's my question.
Okay, I wasn't sure what the question was, but
What is the question about, has the union movement and restaurant workers in general lost the kind of community roots that Nellie Stone Johnson described, and also a broader vision of a different civilization that she called the Commonwealth?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say, Harry, I'd never said that the lessons of the New Deal are irrelevant or to be ignored. As I mentioned, when I started this talk, just before I got on this, I'm lecturing in front of a class of 160 people who are watching along with you. And we spent, just before this lecture, we were talking about the New Deal as a movement, as a moment to look at in terms of what organizing can achieve. What I was saying was that the New Deal, what we don't often talk about is who the New Deal left out.
Sure.
And people were left out because of structural racism. And unfortunately, in this country, we have not done a good enough job of acknowledging those original sins and those original moments of structural racism that unfortunately end up impacting all of us. The exclusion of Black people and Black women from the New Deal impacts white workers and workers of color and everybody today. And yes, I think we've lost a sense of community for sure, but the other thing we've lost is a sense that anybody in any elected office actually cares about us, because these workers over the last 80 years, actually over the last 150 years, have seen both parties, Democrats and Republicans, leave them behind every time the minimum wage has gone up. They have been left out or left behind. What happened under Clinton? Let's remember what happened under Clinton. There was an agreement with the National Restaurant Association when the minimum wage went up with a Democratic Congress that the federal minimum wage would go up as long as the tip minimum wage stayed frozen at $2.13 an hour forever. So I would agree that there's not just a sense of disillusionment or lack of connection to unions and to institutions like unions, but to the Democratic Party or to anybody who's repeatedly in the past represented working people. So I totally agree that this is the moment to think at a more community level, to think how can we serve people and build communities, build organic. Some of the things we talk about in my class are social networks that allow people to build community that goes beyond a sense of we're workers fighting for something, but also a sense of we're community, we're family. This is where I go to enjoy myself and have camaraderie and a sense of collective identity, not just a sense that I'm going to win and I have to fight. So, but I do think this is a moment where that can be recreated, Harry, because for example, we created this relief fund for workers in the wake of the shutdown with the pandemic. And suddenly we were able to provide some very real relief that the government wasn't providing. And suddenly we were able to develop a connection with workers to understand what they were experiencing and to talk to them and in a way that made them feel like they were heard and listened to. And actually they got some relief that they didn't get from anywhere else. And then we've seen these mutual aid circles. We've seen workers organizing on their own in restaurant workplaces in ways that I haven't seen in 20 years of organizing restaurant workers, and people saying, I don't want to go back to work. We shouldn't go back to work without one fair wage. Some of that is happening in new ways too, online spaces where workers are coming together and saying, none of us should go back to work without one fair wage. So I think definitely we've lost some amount of it, but I do think this is a moment where we could recapture some of that if we're willing to be creative, and also if we are willing to acknowledge what the mistakes we made and the things we need to correct now, especially things like structural racism.
Well, I agree with all of that. Let me just make a comment.
All right, I want to get some other questions in too, Terry. So please.
Okay, but let me on the point of what is democracy about. I worked in the civil rights movement for the SCLC as a field secretary. And then in the early 90s, or the Clinton administration, I coordinated something called the New Citizenship with the administration, looking at overcoming the citizen government gap. And we developed a lot of stories and examples and history from the New Deal onward. But the thing that we battled most among the Democrats was the redefinition of citizens as customers of government, the new public management, which had come from the Thatcher administration and swept across the administration in the guise of reinventing government. So the one way to think about the problem with progressive politics is it's become narrow and devaluing of people's talents, capacities, and roots. And and of course, the civil rights movement, nobody in the movement thought democracy was elections and government. They were a necessary tool of the people. But democracy was a way of life that the people built. And we've lost that language in progressive politics. I think if we don't recover that, we're going to.
Well, Harry,
if we don't recover that definition of democracy, we're in trouble.
I think you've given us the subject for our next session. So thank you for that. Chase has a question on labor and climate change. Chase, go ahead. Are you there?
Hear me?
Yeah. Speak a little bit louder, please.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the excellent panel. This has been stimulating. I could ask a dozen questions, but my question is, given the urgency of decarbonization, the need for decarbonization over the next decade or two, and given that is probably the effects of both not decarbonizing or decarbonizing are going to affect people in the working class disproportionately, how best can we coordinate or combine our efforts to build a green economy and to organize labor?
Oh, who wants to take that one?
Mac, I think.
Go ahead, Damon.
I think that's mine.
Yeah.
And let me tell the group here, I've worked on this issue at the AFL-CIO. I've been responsible for it actually for more than a decade, and so I'm not making casual observations here about this question. Chase, and this gives me an opportunity to weigh in on this question of values, because it just so happens that Liz Schuer, the president of the AFL-CIO, made a very, unfortunately, it's not public because of the nature of the setting, but I can talk about it, made a very profound statement about this issue, about climate change and values in a closed-door session at the Vatican this week with both big institutional investors and big companies, which I'll say a word about in a second. But first, I want to go directly, Chase, to what you're saying. I don't think there's anything more important than getting right the connection between climate policy and labor rights and the state of workers in America and around the world. I think if we don't get this right, we're going to lose the fight against climate change. We're simply not going to move fast enough, and the science is going to overwhelm us. And I think if I'm sure everybody on this call is kind of in agreement with this. The events of the last year, I think, are a terrifying glimpse into our future. But there is a reality about the political economy of fighting climate change that a lot of people who care about climate change don't seem to grasp. We have to make climate change, the fight against climate change, tied inextricably both to the fight for good jobs, widely available good jobs, not just for a few people, but for everybody, A. And B, we have to tie it to a belief, to changing people's belief that they are, working people's belief that they are fundamentally excluded from the rooms where decisions are made that affect their lives. It's not enough to simply say, well, we'll have a high minimum wage for people doing sustainable, alternative energy development by fiat. That's not enough. Working people have to feel included in the conversation, right? Not objects of policy and change, but subjects, right? People making the decisions in the room. By the way, if you want to sort of really dig into that point, look deeply into what happened in France when they tried to impose a fuel tax, and there was a popular uprising against it. This in a country where, at least in theory, working people have it pretty good. But the sense of being cut out of the process by President Macron was overwhelming. Now, in the United States, we have an awful legacy here of economic change and technological change being made on the backs of working people. There is no confidence among working people, union or non-union, that change will be good for them. Right? We have to change that. That has to be altered. And that's why President Biden's agenda, both pieces of his agenda are so critical. They are a bet the planet fight, right? But it's not really resolved whether or not the jobs that are going to be created by President Biden's initiatives are going to be good jobs or not, whether people have voice or not, whether they're going to have rights or not, whether or not what's going to happen in a place-based sense around these questions. And there's a deep misunderstanding about this, which is the idea that the fight for a just transition is somehow a moral obligation, but kind of a sideshow in the climate fight. It's not. If there's no just transition in this, and if there's no justice in the workplace, if there's no sense of voice and reinvigoration of democracy around these issues, there will not be climate policy. There will not be climate policy. Donald Trump and his heirs will set climate policy. Right? We got a terrible, terrible warning about this between 2016 and 2020. We lost 4 years we could not afford to lose. Right? We barely are in the fight now in terms of science and engineering. Right? And it all hangs on whether or not it can be, the American people can come to believe with good reason that the fight against climate change will lead to better lives. Now, President Schuller said at the Vatican, and this I think in some ways addresses the kinds of issues Harry was raising. President Schuller said at the Vatican that the issue here is the question of the social value of solidarity. Will market values, will values of greed, will dehumanizing values set the tone for global decision-making around climate, or will solidarity set that tone? Right? The labor movement has always offered, even in some of its less progressive forms, the labor movement has always offered fundamentally the notion that we are not simply chits in a market. Right? And I would say, Harry, to you that if you went to all the places where the vitality that we were talking about earlier, whether it's the self-organizing among restaurant workers that Saru was talking about, or Bessemer, Alabama, or digital media companies, or where there's tremendous amount of organizing going on in New York and Los Angeles, or farm worker organizing, or if you went anywhere where the ferment is going on in the American workplace today, I think you would find the lived practice of solidarity, the lived practice of the kind of way of being that I think you're looking for, very, very much alive and more vibrant, more vital today than it's been in a long time in American society. And I think that the leadership of the labor movement at the very highest level understands this. I think it may, to hear the new Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, Fred Redmond, who was a steelworker from Gary, Indiana, an African-American, out of the shop steelworker from Gary, Indiana, to hear him in Arizona on Labor Day talking about the fight for the PRO Act, right, is to hear the battle cry of a different country in the making, right, and a different country that draws upon the kinds of roots, Harry, that you were talking about. And I want to say a word, and then I'll stop, about the civil rights movement in this respect. And I want to tell a little story about it that just is so powerful to me and motivates me so much. I once had the honor of hearing Andrew Young talk about what he and Dr. King were trying to do in the civil rights movement in an informal setting. And he was talking about the New Deal. He said, he said, Dr. King, he said Martin, he didn't say Dr. King, he said Martin and I, what we were trying to do was we were trying to break the door down to the house of the New Deal. We were not letting that house. He said, we were trying to break that door down. And he said, we didn't understand that while we were banging on the door, they were dismantling the house. He said he said we didn't get that. He said by the time we got the door down, they'd half broken the house. He said I spent my whole life trying to figure out how to lift up the African American community after that destruction. And he said, and this is heartbreaking. He said I didn't succeed. I didn't succeed. He said I wished Martin had been there and not me, and maybe he would have. Now we have a chance. We have a chance to make it right. Right. What Saru was talking about, the ferment that's in the workplace, the political situation we have, the new America that is being born around us, we have a chance to make it right.
So Damon, all you had to do was mention former President Trump and his sons, bring my mood way down. And then, you tell the house getting torn down. I'm getting bummed, but I want to go back to Adam for a second, because I think based on, what Saru said about, how restaurant workers are coming together and actually forming community outside of a union in support of one another, to Harry's point earlier. Adam, you also, I think, had some examples of that taking place in the retail sector. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Saru was mentioning mutual aid. The concept of mutual aid has varying definitions, but I think that what we've seen is this newer, and it's not new. To Damon's point, 100%. It's old. It's actually from the early labor organizing, which I totally agree. But it's this idea and concept that you support your colleagues and you support your community. So in multiple retail campaigns that are just, some of which are just underground external organizing campaigns that we have getting started, workers have set up mutual aid committees for their coworkers to protect each other during COVID. If someone has to take off, they shouldn't have to do that, because of course they should be paid more to be able to afford the complications of what may happen with COVID and everything. But it's something, we had a campaign where we're working with in retail in New York now, that they already had a mutual aid committee, and they're like, well, maybe we should talk about what, like a union. So we reached out to y'all. We have this mutual aid committee we have. So that natural organizing also speaks to what Damon was mentioning earlier, like workers self-organizing. We have sometimes in New York too, some of which, some places had ended up closing, but we'd have workers come to us with a fully formed organizing committee, not really knowing exactly how to leverage their power, but it's super inspiring stuff. I mean, and in this moment, even though, we look to everything, was it a win? Was it a loss? Was it a win? Was it a loss? I think a lot of times it's, all of these things, a lot of these may never turn into specific NLRB union election campaigns, but that doesn't mean it doesn't shift some of the power dynamic at work. It doesn't mean that, workers haven't felt solidarity at a workplace because they had a mutual aid committee, and then they go and they get a job somewhere else, and then that job is a little worse, and they think about unionizing. I think that's the thing of where we think about a broader picture of organizing and what organizing culture is and does. And when even I think all of us have mentioned this, but the feeling of solidarity, right? You don't unionize, or the union doesn't come in. We all know this, but you build your union, right? And that's the biggest thing to think about when you're talking to workers, is you already are building a union with your mutual aid committee, right? What else would you call that? I mean, I would call that a union. You don't affiliate necessarily yet with an official union. You may never, but you're organizing, right? So I think just to say a little bit on that, because it's something we're seeing all over the place. How do we support each other? And that's part of that feeling of solidarity, that radical hope, right? That even in the midst of such a horrible situation with the pandemic and the lack of increasing wages, or this, wage shortage, right? That workers end up having a radical hope at times that are inspiring, right? So I think Damon set the stage of doom and gloom, which we should also interpret, and I appreciate that, because it's true. But at the same time, if we don't also radiate an energy of radical hope, when we see these inspiring moments of workers coming to us, we all have a lot to learn, from how people are self-organizing today. Even though it's happened in the past, I wasn't alive in the 1930s. I don't know what that was like. I've read about it, but I think that this resurgence is really inspiring, and it inspires me, and I think inspires all of us.
I knew, Adam, that you were going to help to uplift us again. And Saru, please carry it on there, sister.
I wanted to say something about the climate change question, if it's okay.
Yes.
You know, I know this is not this audience, but I sometimes get invited because we work on food labor issues to broader environmental or food justice gatherings, pioneers, and other spaces. And you sometimes get asked why isn't everybody working on climate change? It's the most important issue. We're all going to die. You know, why aren't low wage workers working on climate change? And I mean, I think my answer to, I'm sorry, I forgot the person who asked the question. Chase. Obviously, people who are earning $2 an hour and are working 3 jobs, and especially in this moment, if you're still in the industry, you are working nonstop because it's so understaffed. You don't have the capacity to think about climate change. I mean, you care. It's not like you're dumb or you don't know that, you know, it's coming, but you don't have that capacity. And again, there isn't a sense that the people who are talking about climate change, whether again, it be a party or a president or organizations, there isn't a sense that those groups of people or institutions are looking out for you and your needs in a way that would allow you to engage in those fights. So again, if the party is not raising the minimum wage, is leaving you behind at $2, is not getting the Raise the Wage Act across the finish line, it makes it really hard to think about even taking a day off to vote, let alone, or time off to vote, let alone engaging on the issue of climate change. So I couldn't, you know, I totally agree that this is something we need to do, but we have to do it in a way that acknowledges people's lived realities and also allow, you know, work together on things like raising wages and the PRO Act in a way that simultaneously helps those people then engage on climate change. And here's one example of how these things are so interconnected. You know, with increasing climate change, tipped workers who earn $2, $3 an hour across the country, their tips are affected. Every time there's hurricanes, wildfires, cold spells, you know, blizzards, it impacts whether people go eat out. How many people eat out, whether there's outdoor dining or indoor dining, it impacts your tips. It impacts your ability to live. And so of course it impacts also where you live and how you live and everything else that all of us are experiencing just generally. But for these service workers, it also impacts their income, which is so ridiculously variable based on whether customers show up or not. They get paid that $2 wage in a hurricane or not. And the real difference in what they take home is whether people show up and tip or not. And so there are very real impacts, but no capacity to actually organize and engage around these issues unless we can deliver on some very basic things that they are saying that they cannot live without, like a livable wage.
Thanks, Saru. And thank you for reminding me that I do a lot of outdoor dining for the 2.5 weeks that you can do so here in Boston every year. So we've only got a couple minutes left, and I wanted to give each of our panelists, you know, we've talked a lot about, I hope everyone is feeling as inspired to act as I am based on everything folks have said tonight. And I want to give everyone 1 minute, please, each, to offer up what actions people can take, leaving this conversation, heading to their computers and to their phones and to their daily lives. What legislation, is there a website? Tell us how to get involved. Damon, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Saru, and then we'll go to Adam.
All right. Well, Mac, just in case folks haven't been actually looking at my video screen, the transformational change, the legislation that will make structural transformational change in the American workplace is the PRO Act. The PRO Act would make organizing possible in a different way. It would change the bargaining environment. It would end strike breaking. It would get rid of right to work, which has been used to divide working people and is a creature of Jim Crow. The PRO Act has close to 50 votes in the Senate. Right. Like the voting rights bills, which it's so intimately connected with as an agency and as an agent of democracy, it has close to it either has a majority or is very, very close to one. What everyone on this call can do is to lift up the PRO Act to your Congress people, senators, and if you're talking to the administration or the Democratic Party, to those folks, and urge that the PRO Act be brought to a vote and passed. Now, there is no way to pass the PRO Act without, there's no way to pass it without reforming the filibuster. The fate of the PRO Act, the fate of voting rights, the fate of immigrant rights are all tied together and tied to the filibuster. So there's two asks, and it goes to any member of Congress, any senator, any representative of the administration, anyone in a position of responsibility in the Democratic Party. The ask is to support and pass the PRO Act and to reform the filibuster. Right? The fate of the country for the rest of our lives is literally at stake here. The PRO Act by itself has that kind of consequences, but when you add it to voting rights, immigrant rights, and by the way, likely critical components of any attempt to fight climate change, all of these things are going to require filibuster reform. And it's that 1-2 step that people need to do. And basically, if you're talking to anybody in the Democratic Party political structure, from the President of the United States to your local committee person in your precinct, that's what you should say.
Thanks, Damon. Saru.
So we ran a big voter program with restaurant workers in Michigan in 2018, and then again in 2020 in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, obviously key states. And prior to our program, these workers had a 12% voter turnout rate, meaning 88% of restaurant workers never voted before, adults. And we ran a program, a peer-to-peer relational program focused exclusively on raising wages, raising the minimum wage, ending the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, workers telling each other, let's go vote, because if we do, we can potentially get a raise, and which resulted in a voter turnout rate in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia of 40%. So a tripling of voter turnout based on this issue. Here's the problem. People in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia turned out on this issue in very large numbers. And of course, we did the control group and saw it did not work for people who weren't in the program despite the higher turnout rates last year. So the problem is, if we don't deliver on this issue that workers felt like this administration and this Congress would deliver on, I can guarantee you this immense workforce is not going to come out again. And this is 14 million people, 1 in 10 American workers. And so we can't just keep talking to people about, you got to vote and it's important and, let's engage, unless we're actually going to deliver on the things that they are expecting us to deliver on. And so that's the Raise the Wage Act. Biden had prioritized it. This Congress said they were going to do it. We need to get it across the finish line. 8 Senate Democrats have voted no. And there is a plan to attach it to what they call must-pass legislation later this year, but that cannot happen unless we can move some of these 8 Senate Democrats, particularly the 2 in New Hampshire and King in Maine. And we could really use everyone's help to move those folks. We are launching tomorrow a Raise the Wage Voter PAC and a Raise the Wage Voter Fund to support Senate candidates that change their votes on this issue. So we hope everybody can go to our website, One Fair Wage Action, and be a part of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Saru. And by the way, people in New Hampshire and Maine don't like us folks from Massachusetts. They always think we're trying to tell them what to do, but that doesn't mean I can't get in touch with folks that I know in those states to deal with the King and our 2 senators in Maine. Adam, last but not least, what can we do?
Yeah, well, do everything that Damon and Saru said. That's for one, as for starters. I think that the other things to do is, there was an interesting moment during the Amazon campaign where a bunch of people called for a boycott. It wasn't what we were asking for, right? It wasn't what the workers were asking for. So I think what I would say is, like, because there were so many people saying, how do we support Amazon workers? How do we support Amazon workers? And I think that there's the sentiment is just so incredible. It's such a powerful moment. I would say what I started saying to people is, where do you work? Like, do you have a union? Are you a union? Like, have you considered organizing, right? A lot interesting conversations. A lot of people would say, oh, well, I don't know, like I work in a restaurant, so I don't know if like, you know, like if organizing makes sense, or, you know, it's funny when people will go out of their way to support something externally that doesn't directly impact them. But then when it's like, but what about at work? And it's like, oh, well, no, it doesn't make sense here. And we've all heard that before. That's peddling the boss's language, right? So I would say, like, organize your workplace. Organize, like, where does everyone work in your networks of people you know? Connect them to these, to organizing, right? Connect people to the same things that we're mentioning here too. I think that, you know, as we have more organized people, and as there's more resistance, there will naturally be more ability to uplift those resistances to pass these legislations, right? If there were more strikes, if there were more workers taking organic actions, if there were more of this happening, you know, then the PRO Act would be something that would be more feasible. We'd say, you got to pass the PRO Act, because if you don't, you're going to have a problem. And there'd be more of a threat in that, right? And you saw a lot of that. I mean, we saw what happened, or theoretically, we've read about what happened during the New Deal, right? There was a lot of violence. There's a lot of things happening. I'm not saying that's what's needed, but I'm saying that maybe, right? So I think those are the kind of things where there needs to be constant agitation and organizing everywhere. And I know not everyone is in the place where you can organize your workplace, right? So what else can you do? Look for calls to solidarity for the mine workers who are striking in Alabama right now, for strike funds that you can help uplift that are not just one campaign here or there. There's so much opportunities for solidarity, and there's tons of calls for solidarity with workers that are on strike all the time, and uplifting those, because those are the examples that help pave the way for the PRO Act, right? It helps pave the way to uplift those stories to say we need the PRO Act because look how broken this is, and look how broken the system is. So I'd say those two things: you organize your workplace, and then look for those call outs for solidarity, because you can find them, and there are always concrete asks that are out there.
Thank you, Adam. I don't think there's a better note to end on, and I apologize for keeping everyone a few minutes over time. Always happy to do that when it's such an enthralling conversation. And I don't think there's a better note to end on than one of solidarity. So thank you all for participating this evening, for joining us in this conversation. And let's consider this the start of a conversation, and one that we can continue with action in the days, weeks, and months and years to come. Thank you all.